Okay, so in this video we're going to look at the IGCSE Computer Science pre-release. This is for the exams in May 2018. And in this particular video we're going to look at how we store the data for the task, because there's a few different ways you could approach it. So in this first example what I've done is set up 3 lists. This is using Python. In some languages you would refer to these as arrays. But in Python we call them lists. They are slightly different. So I've set up the first one for component name, and I've just listed all the components from the pre-release paper. Notice that they're in quote marks, so they're stored as strings. Then I have another one which stores the prices for each item, so they correspond, so P3 is $100, P5 120, and so on. And then I've also set up a number in stock list, and I've just put in some random numbers for that. That comes in as part of task 2. It might be worth in there having some of the numbers set to 0 for later on, to check what happens when there's no stock of a particular product. So just to show you how this will work, if I print a little example here, we can use a number inside the square brackets as an index for the position we want to point out. So this will hopefully go to 0, 1, 2, 3 and print out 16 gigabytes if I run it. So there we go, it's printed 16 GB, and obviously I could change that to whatever I like and see the result. So the number in the brackets is an index for the position within a list. Now if I just comment that one out, and we'll have a look at this further example here. By the way, these aren't to actually solve the task, just to demonstrate how we can use lists in Python. So slightly more complex now. What I've got is a list that should print me out a few items from each of the lists. So I've got a little title line there, prints choice, price and stock. Then I'm using a for loop, and it's going in the range from 0 and stopping before it gets to index 5. So it should go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and then stop before it gets to 1 terabyte on the components. And then inside that for loop I've printed out from component name, rather than printing a certain index, I've given it the variable here. So I called my iterator, this variable here, position, because it's the position or the index in the array that I want to look at. So the first time around the loop this will be 0. So imagine there's a 0 written in there. Then I've put a few spaces just to spread it out, and then I've done from the item prices list I've gone for position as well, a few more spaces, and then from the stock list position as well. So the first time round that'll be 0, then it'll go back around the loop, and that variable position will move up to 1. So it should then look at the first position, not the 0th, but the first position. So it should get P5, 120 and 23 and so on. Okay, so let's run that now. And there we go. So we've got the headings, and then it's printed out an item from each list. So that doesn't particularly solve the pre-release task, but it just demonstrates how we can use lists and indices within them to find the items that we want. The benefit of structuring our lists like in this example is that we can use that index for several different things. Okay. Now if I move on to a second example, another way of doing it is to use what's called two-dimensional lists. Now I'll just point out this doesn't feature in the specification for the IGCSE. So it's best to check with your teacher whether they are happy with you taking this approach, although I'm told by somebody at the exam board you will not be marked down for using techniques that aren't mentioned in the specification. So let's look at the difference here. We've got again several lists. This first one actually is just what type of component, so we didn't use that in the previous example. And then the components list is what we call a two-dimensional list. So we have an outer list with the square brackets, and there's another closing one later on, and within that we have several inner lists, and hopefully you can see the idea. So just the processor components are stored in their own little list here, and then the RAM components are stored in their own little list, and so on. It gives us certain advantages later on in the task that we can reference things slightly more neatly, but if you're less confident in your programming, I'd probably not take this approach. I'd probably stick with putting everything into these long lists. Okay, So for those who do want to go down a slightly more advanced route, let's have a look at what we can do. I'll just take away the comments from here and add 3 quotes here, so that just ignores everything within these 3 quote marks. So what I've done this time, a bit like on the previous example, is a for loop to see how we can iterate or loop through the components in the list. I'll run it first to show you what I mean. So what's happening this time is we're getting the name of the component type and then a list of the components within that group. But you can see it's slightly more complex. To do this I've done 2 for loops, one within the other, a nested for loop. So the first is looking through this list and iterating through them. I've gone from 0, the first position, up to the length of that list. So it's going all the way to the final item here. And then it's printing the component at that position. And then within that list, so under each of those headings if you like, is another for loop that works through this inner list. Now the way we reference those, it involves 2 lots of square brackets. So you can see here I've got from the components list, I've first got in square brackets component, that's my variable from here. So for example, when I'm looking at processor, that would be 0 because it's the 0th index, and that means it will look at this list here. And then I need a second square bracket to look within that inner list. So this item variable is what I used in my for loop here. Again, it's starting at 0, it's working its way through to the length of that inner list, so it's going 0, 1, 2, and then stopping. So in this case, item at the very start would be P3, and then it'll iterate to P5, and then P7, and then stop. And after it's completed that loop, I've just printed a new line character to make it leave a gap between the lists here. Then it'll exit that loop, come back to the outer loop, and move on to the next component type. Okay, again, this isn't about solving the task, just demonstrating the theory behind it.